I came to the Ironfang pack with only one mission: kill the Alpha. For 10 years I was trained to be the perfect assassin, silent, patient, ruthless, but the moment I stood in front of him, my wolf whispered something impossible. Mate, Chapter 1, The Price of a Life. The envelope arrived the way all my assignments did, slipped beneath the steel door of my training cell at 3 in the morning. No knock, no signature, no mercy. I had learned long ago not to expect mercy from the Hollow Council. They dealt in outcomes. Clean ones. They had no patience for the mess of feelings, which was exactly why they had spent 10 years teaching me to have none. I pulled the photograph out and held it in the low light. Strong jaw. Dark eyes. Even in grainy surveillance footage they carried weight, like a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. He stood at the center of the image the way mountains stand at the center of landscapes, not because someone placed him there, but because gravity simply decided it. Alpha Kael Ironfang, leader of the most formidable wolf pack in the Northern Territories, a dynasty 3 generations deep. Rooted into the mountain ranges between Ashvale and Coldmere like old iron into old stone. The Hollow Council wanted him gone. And so I would make him gone? That was the arrangement, that had always been the arrangement. I turned the photograph over, neutralized before the next full moon, payment upon confirmation, 5 days. I had made harder timelines work with less. I tucked the photograph into the inside pocket of my jacket, flat against my ribs. Directly over my heart, not sentimentality, training. Keep the target's face close. Know it better than your own reflection. Learn the shape of a life before you end it. My name is Sarah Voss. I am 26 years old. I have completed 19 assignments without a single failure. I have never hesitated, never questioned, never allowed the part of me that is still wolf, still feeling, to interfere with the part of me that is the Council's instrument. I had been raised inside the Hollow Council's program since the age of 16. When they found me, a half-feral stray wolf with no pack, no name worth keeping, and enough raw aggression to suggest I could be shaped into something useful, they had not been wrong. They were very good at finding broken things and turning them into tools, what they had not anticipated, in all their careful construction of me, was that tools eventually learn what they are made of. I packed my kit, checked my cover identity one final time. Sarah Voss, traveling healer, specialist in wolfsbane treatments and battlefield wound care, and boarded the transport north before dawn. The photograph pressed against my heart the entire ride, warm with proximity. The face of a man I intended to kill before the full moon crested the mountain peaks of his territory. I did not know, sitting in that transport in the dark, that everything I had ever been built to be was about to become inadequate for the very first time. Chapter TWO. Entering the den. I entered Ironfang territory at dusk. Moving the way the Council had trained me to move through hostile land, low presence, unremarkable pace, nothing in my posture to suggest I was anything other than what my cover claimed. The Ironfang pack had lost 3 soldiers in a border skirmish 10 days prior. They needed medical support. Healers were welcomed into a pack's interior spaces without the suspicion that other outsiders carried. Healers were trusted. That trust was the door I intended to walk through. The compound sat inside a natural bowl carved between 3 mountain peaks. The kind of geography that did not merely shelter a settlement but announced it. We were here before your maps. We will be here after your histories. Stone buildings. Torchlight burning alongside modern electric fixtures. I noted the fire immediately. A pack that kept flame in the age of electricity was a pack that remembered what power felt like in its oldest, most honest form. The walls were thick. The patrol rotations were practiced, not rehearsed. These wolves had defended this ground before and expected to defend it again. The beta met me at the outer gate. He was precisely dressed, precisely for mountain wolf culture, where clothing was generally chosen for function over appearance. pale gray eyes in an angular face. A smile I clocked immediately as constructed, calibrated to the exact width and warmth required too. Read as welcoming, without the underlying sincerity to justify it. He introduced himself as Dorian Vex, Beta and Chief Advisor to the Alpha, Healer Voss. He took my hand and held it a half-second too long. The Alpha will assess you personally before granting access to the injured. Standard protocol for outsiders. Of course, I said pleasantly. I held his pale gaze and smiled with exactly the right measure of deference and let him lead me through the gate inside my chest. The wolf I had spent a decade suppressing pressed unexpectedly forward, not toward the compound. Not toward the mission but toward him. Cataloging exits and structural details with the automatic precision of someone who mapped every space they entered as though planning an escape or an execution. Through a heavy timber door at the end of the east corridor, into a vaulted hall lit by a long channel of fire running down its stone floor like a spine. "The Alpha will be with you shortly," Dorian said and left. I stood in the firelit hall and waited, and the door at the far end opened. Chapter 3. The moment the mission broke, he was standing with his back to me when he entered from the far door, hands braced on a map table along the wall, had bent over something. For one unguarded second I had him completely exposed. Spine turned, attention divided. The column of his neck visible from the doorway across 12 feet of firelit stone. Pure reflex ran the calculation before I could stop it. 2 steps 3 seconds clean. Then he turned. And every piece of training I had was simply not enough. The photograph had not lied about his face. What it had entirely failed to capture was everything else. The density of his presence. The way the firelight moved differently near him as though it had an opinion about him. The particular quality of his stillness. Not absence but a presence so total it had nowhere left to expand and so simply filled whatever space it occupied without effort or performance. Alpha Kael Ironfang into dimensions had been a target. In 3 dimensions, standing across a room and turning to look at me with those dark eyes that had read through every lens that had ever tried to capture them. He was something else entirely. And before I could build a wall fast enough, before I could engage the training and the discipline and the decade of carefully constructed emotional architecture, my wolf threw herself against every barrier I had ever built inside myself and screamed one word. Into the hollow of my chest. "Mate." The word hit like a struck bell and rang and rang and rang. I held my face perfectly still. I breathed through it with the specific controlled technique the council had drilled into me for absorbing shock, without expressing it, pain, fear, surprise, grief, none of it permitted to reach the surface. I had been trained for precisely this scenario, maintaining cover under conditions of extreme emotional disruption. I had never anticipated that the disruption would come from my own wolf recognizing her other half in the face of my target. "No," I told her, in the interior language we had negotiated over years of forced proximity and mutual suppression. "Not now. Not him. Absolutely not." She did not agree. But she understood when I meant it, and she went quiet with the patient certainty of something that knows it does not need to hurry. She had time. She had already said the only thing that mattered. "Healer Voss." His voice was low even. The voice of someone who also knew what it was to keep a leash on an interior creature that had preferences of its own. He crossed the room toward me and I held my ground with everything I had. "Alpha Ironfang," I said. My voice was clean. Level. A small miracle I was quietly proud of. He stopped 3 feet from me and studied my face with the particular attention of someone reading something that exists behind the surface of a thing rather than on it. He looked at me for exactly 4 seconds, I counted, because counting gave my mind something to do other than process the proximity of him. And then something in his expression closed very carefully. The way a door closes when someone on the other side of it has decided not to open it yet. He gave me my assigned instructions in a measured tone. I nodded with exactly the right level of professional compliance. Dorian appeared at the door to escort me to my quarters, and I followed him out. And I spent the entire walk dismantling what my wolf had just done to me with the meticulous precision of someone rebuilding a wall that has just been hit by something much larger than anticipated. By the time I reached my assigned room, I had it contained. File. Refused. I had a mission. I had 5 days. I had never failed. I was not going to let fate have better aim than I did. Chapter 4. What the Wounded Know. The injured were in the East Wing, and I worked through the afternoon without stopping. Real work, wolfsbane contamination requiring careful chemical extraction, field wounds stitched badly under pressure that needed to be redone properly, fever management for 2 soldiers whose immune responses were fighting harder than their bodies could comfortably sustain. Somewhere between the second and third patient, I noticed I had stopped performing the role of healer and simply become one, which was the consistent hazard of holding a cover long enough. If you were good at it, it stopped being performance. The Ironfang wolves watched me with open curiosity and no hostility, which continued to be remarkable. Packs were territorial with outsiders by nature, suspicion was the instinctive response of a group that had learned to protect what it held. But these wolves carried something different in their posture. A settled dignity. The quiet confidence of people who had been given good reason to trust the world they lived inside. They trusted their alpha completely, and that trust had made them generous with strangers. I noted it, filed it. Told myself it was simply intelligence gathering. It was a young soldier named Ren who first put a crack in something I had not expected to feel cracking. 18 at most, leg wound, field stitched inadequately under combat conditions, already showing early wolfsbane contamination. The attacking wolves had tipped their blades, which was a dishonorable tactic and an effective one. He was feverish and fighting it with the jaw-locked determination of a teenager who has decided that today is the day he becomes stoic. You can stop pretending it doesn't hurt, I told him, carefully unwrapping the wound. It doesn't, he said, and immediately winced as I began cleaning the contaminated tissue. I said nothing. I kept working. 30 seconds passed. Then, okay. It does. I know. I'm sorry. The contamination went deep. This is going to be unpleasant for a while. The Alpha says pain is just your body asking for your attention, Ren said through his teeth. You acknowledge it, you give it what it needs, and then you move forward. Something moved through my chest that I categorized immediately as irrelevant. Your Alpha is practical, I said carefully. He's the reason we're all still here. He said it the way you say things that are simply facts, no emphasis, no performance, no expectation that it might be remarkable. 3 years ago, the Hollow Council sent enforcers against us. Said we were harboring fugitive wolves. We weren't. We were just taking in strays nobody else wanted, which the Alpha always does. He sent every non-combatant into the deep forest and held the tree line himself until allies arrived. Ren paused. 30 enforcers. Just him, 2 days. I kept my hands moving. Clean, methodical, precise. I did not let my face change. The Hollow Council. The organization that had trained me. The organization that had handed me this contract. The same organization this feverish 18-year-old was describing as the aggressor in a 3-year campaign against a pack that took in strays nobody else wanted. Led by a man who had stood alone at a tree line for 2 days rather than let his people be taken. I pressed the information flat and filed it somewhere I would look at later. Later came sooner than I intended. Chapter 5. The Archive. On the 3rd night, I moved through the compound alone in the dark the way I always did on the 3rd night of any assignment. A full interior mapping. The building showing me its true version. The one that only exists at 3 in the morning when all the daylight performance has been stripped away. I moved through the Ironfang compound silently and thoroughly and found, in the East Archive, something that stopped me completely. Not weapons. Not contraband. Not anything described in the Council's mission brief, which had characterized Kael Ironfang as a rogue wolf destabilizing the Northern Territories. Files, hundreds of them. And they were not Ironfang Pack records. They were Hollow Council records. I stood in that room for a long, still moment, and then I started reading. I had 90 minutes before the night patrol rotation brought a guard past this wing. I used every second. What I found across those 90 minutes rewrote everything. The Council had been running a sustained campaign against the Ironfang Pack, not monitoring a threat, but manufacturing one. The files documented fabricated border violations, falsified aggression reports submitted to inter-pack governing bodies, strategic assassinations of pack allies designed to isolate them politically. Every story about Kael Ironfang as a danger to territorial stability was a story the Council had authored and seeded and cultivated over 3 years. None of it was real. All of it had been architected to justify one eventual, inevitable outcome, his elimination. And the source of most of these fabrications, the provider of internal pack intelligence, the map of compound vulnerabilities, the tactical briefings that had kept the Council's campaign accurate and current, appeared again and again across document after document in a single name. Dorian Vex Beta. Chief Advisor. The man with pale eyes and a constructed smile, who had greeted me at the gate and held my hand 1/2 second too long. I sat down on the cold stone floor of that archive with the documents across my lap and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water and like fire simultaneously, exactly what had happened. I had not been sent here to remove a threat to the Northern Territories. I had been sent here to finish the work of a traitor, who had been dismantling his own Alpha from the inside for 3 years, and had not yet completed the job. The Hollow Council had built me into a weapon for their specific use. And they had aimed me at the one man in the Northern Territories with enough integrity and enough power to stand between them and total dominance of the region. The one man my wolf had recognized as hers the moment I walked into his hall. I gathered the most critical documents and sat in the dark archive with them, and had a conversation with myself that I had never before been equipped to have. What are you really? The Council's answer: an instrument. A function. A clean outcome. The wolf's answer, quiet and certain from somewhere below the training and the conditioning and the decade of careful construction. Something more than that. You always were. You just weren't allowed to look at it. I looked at it. Chapter 6. What I chose instead. I found Kael in the courtyard at first light. He was standing at the far edge watching the mountains with his hands behind his back, entirely still, in the way of a man who has made peace with vigilance, who no longer experiences watching for danger as anxiety but simply as the natural shape of his days. He heard me coming from 20 feet. Of course he did. You move like someone taught to disappear, he said, without turning. I need to tell you something, I said. I need you to hear all of it before you respond. He turned and looked at me with those eyes that had been reading something behind my surface since the first moment I walked into his hall. And whatever he saw in my face now, the weight of what I was carrying, the absence of the careful performance I had been sustaining for 4 days, made him go still in a different way. Not the stillness of vigilance. The stillness of a man bracing for a truth he has been quietly waiting to arrive. Say it, he said. So I did. All of it. Who I was, what the Council had sent me to do, what I had found in the archive, what Dorian had been feeding them from inside his trust for 3 years. I watched his face as I spoke, and I saw grief move through it. Not surprise, but the specific grief of a confirmed suspicion. The grief of someone who had loved a person they should not have trusted and now had to hold both those things at once without flinching. When I finished, the courtyard was quiet. The mountains held the early light. Neither of us moved. Dorian, he said. Not a question. A reckoning with a thing already known, yes. A long silence. I suspected, he said finally. For 2 years. Small things, information that reached the Council, that could only have come from inside these walls. Tactical failures that had the specific shape of betrayal rather than error. But without proof, without certainty, he stopped. His father served mine. He has been beside me since before I took the Alpha title. I could not act on suspicion and risk being wrong about a man who had given 30 years to this pack. The archive is your proof, I said. Documented in the Council's own records. 3 years of correspondence, tactical briefings, internal intelligence. Enough to take before the Northern Wolf Assembly and end this cleanly. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, you could have left. Once you found the files, the mission was compromised and you had a clean exit window. You could have gone back to the Council, reported the target eliminated, taken your payment, and disappeared. Started somewhere new under a different name. No consequences. Yes, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about Ren saying he's the reason we're all still here with no performance in it whatsoever. I thought about a man who had stood at a tree line for 2 days because the wolves behind him were worth every cost. I thought about my wolf, who had spoken one word on the first night, and had been waiting since with the patience of something that knows the truth does not need to be said twice to be true. Because some things matter more than the mission, I said. I've been figuring out which things for a long time. This one qualifies. The courtyard light fell between us, and in it something shifted in his expression. The careful control he wore the way I wore mine, parting just enough to show what it had been containing. Something that had been waiting just as long as mine had. My wolf, he said quietly, choosing each word with care, has been saying something about you since the moment you walked through that door. Mine has been saying the same thing about you, I said. I've been arguing with her for 4 days. Who's winning? She is, I said. She usually does. I just make her work for it. Something crossed his face that was, I realized, a real smile, not the contained half-expression I had been cataloging since our first meeting, but an actual, brief, unguarded smile directed entirely at me. And it hit me somewhere behind the sternum with a force I had absolutely no training to withstand. And I decided, standing in that courtyard in the early light, that I was done pretending I did. Chapter 7. The beta moves. Dorian moved that night. He had been watching me with the same careful attention I had given the compound, drawing his own conclusions about a healer who didn't sleep and moved through darkness like someone trained to do it. He was intelligent. Traders who survive as long as he had generally are. It requires a sustained, disciplined attention to the people around you and the stories they believe about you. He came for me first, which was his first and fatal miscalculation. He believed, correctly, that I was the immediate threat, but he did not know I had already spoken to Kael, which meant every calculation about his timing and outcome was wrong before he took the first step. The corridor outside my room was dark. I had mapped it 3 nights prior with the thoroughness I applied to every space I inhabited. I heard him before I saw him, the controlled breath, the slightly too precise boot placement of someone who had learned stealth from instruction rather than from years of operational practice. Good technique. Not good enough. I let him open the door. I let his momentum carry him into the room. Then I stepped from the shadow beside the door frame and redirected that momentum, and had him against the wall with his arm inverted before he processed that the room was not empty and waiting for him. The communication code, I said very quietly against his ear. The one you used to report to the council. I need it. You're going to be marked for termination, he said. His voice was admirably steady. They'll send more operatives. Better ones. Let them the code. You don't understand what you're disrupting. 3 years of careful, I read the archive, I said. All of it. Your name appears in 47 documents. The code Dorian. Last time I asked pleasantly. He gave it to me. He was, beneath the curated precision and constructed charm, a man who had built his entire survival strategy on other people doing the violent work. When the violent work arrived at his own door, he found his preparation for it had been entirely theoretical. I secured him in the East Archive, the particular satisfaction of locking him inside the physical evidence of his own 3-year betrayal, before the compound's first alarm bell rang in the distance. Kael met me in the corridor, fully dressed and moving, because he had been awake and waiting. He had known Dorian would act. He had spent years learning to read the specific texture of this particular betrayal. He's contained, I said. I have his council communication code. I can send a false confirmation of your death. It buys us for 6 weeks before they recalibrate and send another operative. Enough time to build the formal assembly case. There's no secondary contact, he said, before I could raise the concern. Dorian wouldn't have tolerated competition for the position. It was power to him, not simply money. He looked at me with steady attention. You've already mapped the next 3 phases. I think in phases, I said. It's a habit. What does the next phase after this one look like? I knew what he was actually asking. The question had more weight than its words, because after was not territory I had ever inhabited. And he knew it, and he was asking anyway, gently, giving me the choice without applying the pressure. I haven't fully decided, I said. Which was honest. And which was, even as I said it, already less true than it had been 6 hours prior. Chapter 8. The full moon. We sent the false confirmation at dawn. Dorian's code, my phrasing, the council's own format turned against them like a blade taken from an enemy's hand. Clean, efficient. I built the assembly case across the following 2 days, organizing 3 years of the council's own documentation into an argument so precisely constructed it could not be disputed or deflected. Information as a weapon. Precision as a discipline. The council had made me into an instrument for their use. I was discovering that instruments, once they understand their own construction, can choose their own aim. The full moon rose on the 4th night after Dorian's arrest. The pack gathered in the mountain clearing the way wolves have gathered at the full moon since before the concept of packs was formalized, instinctively. Drawn by something older than habit or instruction, I stood at the edge of the clearing and watched. Ren stood with 2 other young soldiers, his leg healing cleanly now, no longer performing stoicism because he no longer needed to. The older wolves moved with the unhurried confidence of people who have survived worse seasons and know the shape of their own endurance. Children chased each other through the firelight with the magnificent indifference to history that children carry when they are genuinely, structurally safe. And at the center of it all, the way he stood at the center of every photograph, the way he had stood at the center of his hall the first moment I saw him, Kael, moving through his pack with the full attention of a man who understood that leadership was not distance but proximity. Not authority performed from above but presence offered from within. My wolf did not say anything. She didn't need to. She had said her piece for days into an assignment I had arrived to complete, and she had been patient with my resistance. And now she simply settled into the most contented quiet I had ever felt from her. The quiet of something that has finally arrived at the place it was always moving toward. Kael looked up from across the fire and found me at the edge of the clearing. He always found me. I had stopped trying to understand how. It was simply the fact of him, the way his awareness extended to wherever I was without apparent effort, as though my position in any given space was information he was perpetually and quietly updated on. He held my gaze across the firelight, and everything that had been building between us since that first moment in the hall was present in that held gaze, patient and certain and entirely done pretending to be anything other than what it was. I walked across the clearing. I had crossed harder ground. I arrived at his side and stood there, and it felt, for the first time in 10 years of moving through spaces as a ghost, a visitor, a threat, like arriving somewhere I was supposed to be. How does it feel? He asked quietly, eyes still moving over his pack. Standing inside something instead of outside it. Strange, I said honestly. I'm not certain I know how to do it correctly. You're doing it right now, he said. That's generally how learning starts. His hand found mine at my side. Warm and steady, the hands of a man who had held things worth protecting for a long time and understood the weight of that commitment. I looked down at the 2 hands in the firelight, the assassins and the alphas, and I thought about all the wrong roads that had delivered me, stubbornly and improbably, to this exact place. The council will recalibrate, I said. Eventually. They'll send someone better equipped. I know, he said. I've been working on the patrol rotations. There are 3 Eastern approach vulnerabilities they've been exploiting in their tactical briefings, Sierra, he said. And I want to train 6 of your soldiers in the close quarters counter protocols the council uses, so your people recognize, Sierra. His voice was low and warm and precisely, gently amused. You're allowed to just stand here. I looked at the fire. At the pack gathered around it. At the mountains rising around the bowl of this compound like hands cupped around something that had decided to survive. I'm not very good at just standing, I admitted. Neither am I, he said. We'll figure it out together. Epilogue. What I came here for 6 months after I arrived at the Ironfang pack with one mission and a photograph pressed against my heart. I stood at the outer gate in the early morning and watched the sun climb the mountains and understood that I had been wrong about something fundamental for a very long time. I had been trained to believe that belonging was a vulnerability. That attachment was a weakness the council had done me the favor of removing before it could compromise my function. That the wolf inside me, the part that wanted pack, wanted bond, wanted the irreplaceable weight of a mate, was a liability to be managed rather than a truth to be lived. The Hollow Council had spent 10 years making me into a perfect instrument. What they had not accounted for was that instruments, given enough proximity to what they were actually built for, occasionally discover it, Dorian had faced the Northern Wolf Assembly for weeks prior, stripped of rank, formally exiled. The council's primary leadership was navigating criminal proceedings in the Interpack courts. Their 3-year campaign against the Ironfang Pack documented in their own meticulous hand and laid before a governing body they had spent years claiming to represent. It was not a clean ending. Nothing this tangled ever ended cleanly, and I knew better than anyone that organizations like the Hollow Council did not dissolve. They reconstituted in quieter corridors, under different names, with more patience and less visibility. There would be future attempts, future contracts, future operatives arriving at this gate with photographs pressed against their chests. But I would be here when they arrived. I was, it turned out, very good at this specific kind of work. I knew every tactic the council had ever trained into any operative because they had trained them into me first. I knew their communication codes and their cover identities and their preferred infiltration windows. I knew every weakness they would try to exploit because I had once been the thing they aimed at, though. Say weaknesses, the territory would be protected. I would see to it. The territory was mine now. Kael came up behind me at the gate. I heard him the way I always heard him, the specific frequency of his approach distinct from every other sound the compound produced. As familiar to me now as my own heartbeat. He stopped at my shoulder and we stood in the early light in the silence we had built together over 6 months. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had stopped performing presence for each other and had learned simply to share it. Any regrets? He asked. I thought about the version of myself who had boarded a transport north in the dark with a clean mission profile and a decade of conditioning telling her, "You are only a weapon. You do not have a future. The after belongs to someone else." I thought about who she had been and where she had been going and what she had been built to do. And I thought about all the ways that none of it had accounted for a wolf's instinct in a firelit hall and a feverish boy saying he's the reason we're all still here and an archive full of 3 years of evidence that the world was not the shape the council had drawn for me. None, I said. And meant it with everything I had. Not the trained self. Not the council's instrument. Not the performance of a woman with no attachments and no future. All of it. The wolf and the woman and the hard one. Genuine peace between them. His hand found mine. The mountains held the light above us. Behind us the compound was waking. Voices and footsteps and the distant sound of Ren laughing with entirely too much energy for this hour of the morning. I had come to the Ironfang Pack with only one mission. I had ended up with something the Hollow Council had never once been able to account for in any mission profile, any training program, any careful construction of a woman with no feelings and no future beyond the next clean outcome, a home. A pack that had chosen to remain itself against everything designed to unmake it. A mate who had stood alone at a tree line for 2 days, not because he was without fear, but because the wolves behind him were worth every single cost. And a wolf in my chest who had known all of this the moment I stepped through the gate. Who had been patient with my resistance and quiet about her certainty. Who had never doubted for a single moment that the word she whispered in that firelit hall was the truest thing I had ever been told. She had been right all along. It just took me a little while to stop arguing with her. I squeezed his hand. The mountains kept the morning and I stayed.